Hi, everybody. My name is Karen Stiller, and I am the author of The Minister's Wife, a memoir of faith, doubt, friendship, loneliness, forgiveness, and more, published in 2020.
And hi, I'm Carolyn Weber, and I am the author of Sex and the City of God. And I have also written Surprised by Oxford that provided a little bit of context to that book. And it was Sex and the City of God was just published this year with IVP, International Varsity.
And I loved your book, Carolyn.
Thank you.
It
And
was
I'm
so
glad
wonderful.
because it would be awkward. I love yours as well.
That would be so awkward.
That would be so
And
awkward.
it would make this a terrible idea, what we're doing. So what we're doing is we thought it would be really fun for you and I, at least, to get together and just talk about, a little bit about our books, but I think mostly about this type of writing. And I think
Mhm.
we've both been writers for a while, and this is a kind of writing that people like to explore even as writers. So anyway, enough about that. That's what we're trying to do today, is just have a little chat about
Mhm.
this sort of thing. So I would like to ask you, first of all, Carolyn, and I loved your book. I absolutely
Thank
gobbled it
you.
up. I think I told you I read it almost in one sitting, dying
Wow.
to find out what happened at the end. Um, how Sex and the City of God, a memoir of love and longing, was a different writing experience for you, maybe, than your other two books, Surprised by Oxford and Holy is the Day.
That's such a good question. And I was excited to talk about this topic too, Karen, because I think that memoir writing is the question that I'm asked about the most often by any type of interview or any group of writers or any event I'm at. That's usually the general question that gets the most attention or interest. And so with Surprised by Oxford, I never intended to write it. It was actually just grew out of years of talking about my conversion story with students and things. And so I actually started writing it more as a personal journal, and then really started thinking about writing the first chapter when I was pregnant with my twins. But I put it aside. I was warned as an academic at a secular institution not to publish anything about my faith until I had tenure. So I sort of put it on the back burner, and I thought, whatever. And I was a little bit nervous, and I was much younger. And then after the birth of my twins, which was a pretty big line in the sand for prioritizing things, I
Yeah.
finally just thought, no, I'm going to write it. And I wrote it on my sabbatical. So it was my very first time in that genre. I had always been trained as an academic. But with Sex and the City of God, I had already written Surprise by Oxford, Holy is the Day, and it grew much more purposely out of conversations with my publisher and out of women's conferences, working with students for many years. People really seem to have an interest in knowing how to navigate dating and courtship and marriage and that sort of thing, and even our relationship to relationships. Once, especially if you've been a believer or you haven't been a believer and then you become a believer, that kind of thing. And so it originated sort of looking at those things as maybe somewhat of a sequel, but then it became far more personal for me because I was writing it alongside my marriage. So I wasn't claiming to be a sexpert or a marriage
That would
expert
be
or
okay.
anything like that. It actually originally really just originated with what I was sort of talking to students about on ideas of dating or, being new to the landscape as a believer. But then it really actually grew from writing it over a course of several really intense and rich years in my marriage and as a new mom. So it's sort of, that's how it shaped that one. So it was very different.
So
Yeah.
spiritual memoir, which we both know has so much to do with our journey with God and others, and discovery
Yeah.
and learning. And I wondered, I was thinking it would be helpful if we could talk a little bit about what spiritual memoir is and what it does. And why don't you go
Mm-hmm.
first, and
Mm-hmm.
then I'll just add on, which I'll
Okay.
probably have nothing to add on.
Because I use every word in the universe according to my husband. So at the end of the day, have you used up your words yet, honey? Can I
I,
can I watch the news now? But it's an interesting genre because as a literature professor, I had actually taught lots of different genres, but spiritual memoirs, spiritual autobiography has a long, rich history, and I'd never really thought about it that way. Rooted in Paul, actually, and then in Augustine. So it has this really interesting, rich history. But I've always I've really enjoyed writing it and working in it, Karen, because I really believe in our testimonies as bearing witness to the goodness of God in our lives. And that's not always happy, happy, joy, joy either. Sometimes that's actually writing about something that you've worked through that's been incredibly painful or difficult, or has been an act of trust or faith. And I find that it's really the genre that I learn the most about myself in before God, but that I also pray about and hope to have some sort of testimony of his goodness in my life to others.
Yeah.
And that's where I have felt I've been most enriched reading others' spiritual autobiographies as well. So I think that's the big difference for me between regular autobiography and spiritual, and especially Christian, is really looking at the bearing witness to God's goodness in our lives, and looking back to and having sort of a grace-filled retrospect, that you might not seeing things differently through his grace and through the redemptive work he's done than you did when you were in the midst of it. So for me, it's a very different and distinct genre.
Yeah, I love that. That's really helpful. And where I get nervous sometimes with Christian writing is when it's like writing on a mission. So a writer might sit down and think, okay, I'm going to write about, explaining that God is always faithful, which I know he is. But to set out with this maybe narrower goal takes away from the discovery part of spiritual memoir writing, which I think is really important to. I have this little phrase I use for myself: explore, don't explain, ponder, don't preach, which has kind of been helpful for me to that as I discover as I write, I think that's just better and richer. And so then it's less about convincing someone of some truth that may be true.
Yes.
And it's more about inviting someone in along a journey and sharing stories. And I love how you pointed out the spiritual memoir is actually pretty ancient. And that occurred to me at some point too. I thought, because I think I've been a professional writer for years, and I think I was a little shy about writing memoir, thinking, I had to wrestle with the who cares question.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Of course, who cares? And yet I also think too about, if I had to sit down with anyone, would I want to sit down with someone famous and trite, or someone unknown by worldly standards who has really tried to work through finding wisdom in their lives through God? And that's not saying that I've done that. I'm just saying that I really enjoy and benefit from sort of the fellowship through reading, as opposed to just basic company, so or even the difference between just even information and wisdom, right? And so I'm always fascinated by stories in which people have actually really tried to work through their relationship with God, or really tried work growing. And I would agree, it's really, I'm nervous sometimes too of platitudes or being trite. And it's a tightrope walk, especially I think for memoirists of faith, because many of those scriptural verses that sometimes feel really rote in media or in culture are deeply true, and there's this truth that lies too deep for frost, and it really bears repeating. And sometimes they are the most perfect and apt thing to say. And yet other times, some of those phrases or whatnot can seem really empty. So trying to find that sort of walk that fine line and that tension between them, I also think is really important in that genre.
Now, did you just say the truth that lies too deep for frost?
Yes, that's Tolkien.
Oh, that's wonderful. And
isn't that a beautiful?
it is
Yeah.
so beautiful. And your book is filled with beautiful references. That's one thing I enjoyed, just the good read, but I also enjoyed the big G good read of it. Like I was learning and being pulled into great, reminded of great literature of the past. And so
Oh, well,
that's a
that's good,
beautiful
because it's
gift you
usually
bring.
just a result of being a book geek, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah,
But he
sure.
has that wonderful phrase, the roots that lie too deep for frost. He means the truth. He's talking about, we see the tree, but the roots of the truth lie. And that's where I love the language of illusion. So often people say it so much better than I would, but that's again the company of reading.
Right.
And that's also, I think, the power of scripture. It can feel so rote, and it can feel so overworn, and like we toss these words around, but they're actually incredibly powerful. It's just that when they fall into stereotype, we've sort of, we've made them into a platitude, and that's not actually giving justice to their correct electrical current.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I thought we could chat about vulnerability a little bit because
That's a hard word to say 5 times fast.
and a hard thing to do.
Yes.
But you do it so well. And I think there's a courage
Oh, thank you.
always.
You do too. You do too, because we're both writing books about fairly intimate spaces, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I wondered, I've been asked this question, and I'm guessing you have too, about because we both write about our husbands,
Hmm. Whose
inevitably.
names rhyme. Isn't that weird?
Oh, yes, you're right. Brent and Kent.
And our names are similar. Ooh.
Maybe we'll need to write together someday.
We might, yeah, have to do a homonym book together.
Yeah. So I wondered, okay, did Kent, like, at what point was he like, go, Carolyn, do this? Or was he ever hesitant? When did he read it? Tell me about that.
Those are all really big questions because I think that's at the center of memoir in so many ways, right? Is
Mhm.
I always try when I first cut my teeth on memoir, I that bothered me so much, how to represent people or people especially you're married to or you're living, with your relationships. And I really prayed over that and presenting people. And I sort of tried to operate by the golden rule, write about others as you would want to be written
That's good.
about. And if it's not a way you want to be written about, then change the identifying characteristics and work with your editor.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but also if it is someone that you're writing about, personally check in with them, of course, if they're in your life, or have them read drafts or talk with them about it. And I think with a book like this too, Kent and I had gone through a lot over the last few years. There were a lot of things I think in memoir that we obviously leave out as
Mhm,
well.
mhm.
The whole painful process of selection, right, is the most important part of creation, as Coleridge says. And I think there's, for all of us who are artists, there's parts on the cutting room floor. And so I know he was aware of things that I was careful to just allude to in larger ways so that, you try to veer away from TMI, too much information, but you're
Yes.
also trying, to give what's truthful and real in a way that you hope would help someone else, or that you hope at least would lend veracity to your story in a real way, and what you're trying to work through before God. So I think it has to be personal for each person. You know, uh, he grew up as a pastor's kid. He's very supportive of ministry. He's very sort of alert of a larger picture. This book grew and shifted and changed through a pretty hard time that we went through,
Mm.
with an intersection of a lot of things, and yet God is good and He's present in that.
Yeah.
And so I think I did try to be careful in that too, and you always try to be sensitive. And I think what's always interesting too, Karen, is sometimes I have found things I write about that I would expect might bother someone, and it's going to be sensitive, and I run it past them. They're not bothered by that at all. They're actually bothered by some other like random detail. Like my sister, I love my sister to bits. My sister's so awesome. She became a believer a few years ago. She is just somebody I respect to the moon and back. But I was careful about how to present her or whatever else. She's never concerned about that. She's more worried about like how I'm saying how her hair looks, or if her arms are toned, or she'll be like, she's like, I don't, is that the color of the sweater I wore? Are you sure? Like,
Interesting. That's really
yeah, it's
interesting.
so interesting. The
Yeah.
things that I ran past Kent were things that I entirely thought he might, would, is this okay, do you think, to share? Like, was this something I would have thought this would have bothered you? And there were other areas that were more sensitive, or areas that we were careful to just more allude to and pass
Hmm.
over.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to know the same thing with you, because I think with marriage, like what can be so tricky is how to navigate that kind of space with someone else that you're also trying to be responsible to,
Hmm.
and thoughtful to, and yet you're also trying to share, especially for others. Like what I found in your book was, I mean, one of those sentences I remember just popped off in huge print for me out of your book was when you were first married and trying to navigate how to be a Christian wife.
Hmm.
I mean, I just stopped there because that was exactly how I felt. And that's
Okay.
exactly how I know so many of my sisters have felt. And yet, that is a brave thing to say
Hmm.
too, right? Because
Yeah.
you're actually stepping right into
Yeah.
um, a hailstorm, right? Of ways that we can maybe feel we shouldn't say that, or, that's,
Right.
lots of cultural questions in that too. So I think it gives people a space, a space to be real and intimate with the writer
Mhm.
and to work through their own issues before God. But, I think too, I felt all the way through yours that you were respectful and gentle and thoughtful as well. And a great strength that I've admired in memoirists, you have this very much this gift as well, is self effacement. And I
Mhm.
think that goes a long way. And a genuine self effacement, the fact that I'm actually trying to learn about what I'm doing wrong here or what I'm learning
Yeah.
here, as opposed to I'm trying to write about the plank in my own eye, as opposed to this splinter in someone else's.
I think that is crucial, that I always tried to write as myself as student, not teacher. To me, that's a
Yeah.
very important distinction. Uh, and I genuinely feel that way, so that helps. But but as a writer, like, you do need to be aware of that, I think, and that is a
Yeah.
pitfall for, I think, maybe particularly for Christian writers. But I was thinking about, because I was talking to a group of writers the other day about this
Mm.
issue of vulnerability, and also, Brent. And I mean, my whole book
Mhm.
is in some ways about his vocation as well, right? Being a minister. And
Mhm.
so I did definitely have a do no harm, filter that I kept
Sure.
in front of me all the time. But somebody asked me about, in the one of the early chapters. It might be the marriage chapter. I'm not sure. Anyway, I talk about him. We broke up early in our relationship, and he
Yes, I
said,
remember that.
"I don't love you, and I don't think I ever will." And I put that in
Mhm.
the book.
Mhm.
And so this person asked me about that, and then she very intuitively said, "Were you trying to signal that this was going to be a really honest book?" And I thought, you know what? I don't think I was consciously doing that, but I can see that it serves that
Mm.
purpose, that little
Yeah.
anecdote, which some of the younger women in our church now have given Brent a very hard time about. You actually said that to Karen? But he was willing to let it stand. And he didn't actually read the manuscript until very late in the process, because
Kent as well, yeah.
yeah, I didn't want, well, I'll be curious to hear why. For me, I didn't want him to say stop, and I didn't want him to
Mm.
correct my theology, which I was worried about. And
One of the banes of being married to the pastor.
exactly, exactly. But in the end, he didn't. He had a couple, like, did that happen then? Tweaks, but
Yes.
he was fine with it. And I think that he's brave. Like, I think he's the brave one, really. But so tell me about Kent and his
Well, and I think too, it's also how you can never anticipate the many ways that somebody's going to read things too. Because when I read that statement from Brett, I thought it was hysterical. I thought it was really funny that he said
yeah,
that,
yeah,
because we all say those kind of things and we look back at them in our relationships, and we think, yeah, that was wrong. Like, God really had a surprise for us. Like, I
yes.
was so mean to Kent when we first met at Oxford. I was so mean. He was such an irritating Christian.
Well, you
I
seem
put the guy
hard to
down all
get.
the yeah, like I just if he I mean, and if he ever quoted me in a book he wrote, it would be entirely correct, and he would be right to
Yeah.
say it, but you look at it with a sense of humor too, because you
Yes.
realize, like, we just don't know the mind of God, and actually God's sense of humor. I thought it was hysterically funny that Brent said that.
Oh, good, good.
But and I did think it was honest, but I didn't think it was hurtful at all.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's actually sometimes those kind of things in marriage stories are are really beautiful, because we see how God uses them,
absolutely. Yeah.
and how they transform. And again, that goes back to the power of memoir as the
Mhm.
testimony of God's goodness in our lives. Um, for for Kent too, I'm always been a writer. I like to write as much of mine as I can before anyone reads it. I kind of like to have a fuller draft, and then maybe because I'm always mindful of people's time, or I'd rather, I'm kind of a private writer, and I hadn't thought about that, not wanting to be stopped, kind of wanting to
Mm.
have a momentum. And I think for women too, perhaps as well, we are stopped and interrupted so often.
Good point.
In every way, shape, and form, that sometimes my writing is my space with
Mm,
God, and I want to
mhm.
be able to think something all the way through. And, and and be able to hand it to someone that I trust, a couple of friends, or, a loved one, my sister Kent, or whatever, when it's actually kind of more in a space where I feel it might not be perfectly done. I'm open, obviously, to still editing or, feedback or things along the way. But I will sometimes ask for some feedback earlier on for major signposts or shifts or changes. As I said, this book really grew differently from what was first anticipated.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm the same way. So I like to kind of have more feedback after I've had a chance to at least get some of my working thoughts all the way out.
Right.
And because you don't want to be spoken over, and yet you want to be respectful. And I think sometimes too, there's a lot of beautiful power and healing and actually getting at what you wanted to say in a way that you're trying to be careful and thoughtful about, but you haven't been interrupted.
Yes.
By whatever force, even spell check.
Exactly. And there's something about the wholeness of a piece too, like the entire, the whole story, the whole entire narrative arc, all of
Yes.
that, like don't react yet. Wait till you get to the next chapter.
Exactly. Because I remember when I do talk about the momentary temptation of, a prior boyfriend, which so many other women in particular, they've shared that with me. How everything always looks greener when you're exhausted or worn out or in a hard space. It's always like that. And I remember thinking, I hope, Kent doesn't get to that chapter and think, I'm not reading anymore. This is terrible.
Yeah.
And so he was able to see how it went to the whole end, but actually he had less issues with that than some other stuff.
Interesting.
So, it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
How, again, that's always the surprise I find with memoir.
Yeah. And, the other thing that you've touched on there is that, beautiful Me Too moment when people see themselves in your story and, feel better, I guess, really, just in a really basic way, feel better about themselves. But what I have received from my book being out in the world is just also a beautiful reassurance for me, like that, oh, you feel like you're not alone, but you've told me that, and now I don't feel I'm so alone either in my, sin or my confusion or my whatever mistake making.
Yes.
I have found that to be such a gift.
Yes, and I would imagine, especially with what you wrote about, because you have the added layer, the notion of the ministry and minister's wife, an added layer. I wasn't ever having to worry myself about Kent's career or
Right.
his position. As a PK, I think that's why he's not a pastor.
Probably.
Like, yeah, yeah. There's all sorts of other layers, and often we're so quick to say, oh, to judge people and to say, oh, there shouldn't be extra layers, but there are in different things. Like there are so many unspoken things.
Yeah.
And in addition to personal hurt or pain or carefulness. So I think that you had a very difficult ground to navigate in particularly, and yet it gives people permission. And I think what I wanted to do, while I was not married to a pastor necessarily, was to also explore the ordering of our loves. That was a big part of it as from Augustine for me, but also thinking about what I'm telling my children and what I'm telling, these students that are in my office. And I always hear the same thing, I've had this one night stand and I feel empty, or, I am a Christian, but now I'm dating a non-Christian. And without, again, trying to be heavy handed or teaching, but saying, wow, this is like, actually, when I went through this, these are really the things that I thought in that as well. And actually, these are the things that I'm also grateful, not to pat myself on the back, because there are many times I was not obedient or I struggled, but there are times where, to really remind people of God's faithfulness.
Yes.
And and living out into a future we can't see. And that faith really is, blind. It really is having a different set of eyes. And that is blessed often. And that's why I tried to bring my book full circle with my father's message that he left, after he passed, that I picked up, because, we don't anticipate how those things will play out.
Yeah.
For all the other struggles that we can't see, past, and all the other things that we long for or feel empty in when we're caught in that temporal time. We're not thinking of the eternal city. We're so caught in the temporal. And I think that that's got an added layer of stressors to navigate when you're also, your partner has got a public persona, or particularly a ministry persona, right? Where there's so much pressure to never make a misstep,
Right, right. And not
which
be,
is unbelievable too.
yeah, and not be human. Like one of my personal favorite little bits about my own book, which probably sounds weird to say, but
No,
um,
not at all. I think
I,
it's important to have that.
well, I wrote just about my sort of surprise in a way watching him like in front of the church doing things, but I go on a little digression about, this guy who honks his horn and likes zombie movies and is an Alison Krauss fan and, whatever, like, and I had fun with that because I was like, yeah, they are real people, and I know that because of course I'm married to one and we hang out with them and I know how much fun they are. And, but
Yes.
people don't know them sometimes in that way. So for me, that was just like, it was like 4 lines, but I was happy to write them and put them in the book.
Yes, yes. And it is real. And I think that's what's so enticing about Jesus, is he's
Mhm.
real.
Yeah.
When we meet people, as that's what I loved about Christians. I mean, no matter, we're all sinners and we all fall short, Christian or non-Christian, but with Christians, you can meet high and you can meet low. There's at least the really real. And when we meet in Jesus, Jesus is the real, capital
Yeah.
R.
Yeah.
And I struggled with, like when people read Surprised by Oxford, everyone thought it was so romantic and wonderful because it ends with us getting together, and it is, and it's lovely. I'm so grateful for that story. And it wasn't like I was actually trying to burst that bubble, or that wasn't something that hadn't happened or whatever. But when I was writing a marriage book, then later looking at relationship and marriage, I thought, this, you have to be real, especially as a
Yeah.
follower of Jesus. And that, again, that doesn't mean you spill everything, but that even the most well-intentioned love can become an idol.
Hmm.
And we don't think of those things. We are always so quick, to judge the crack addict or the alcoholic or, the sex addict or whatever else. And we don't think
Yeah.
of the ways that we're tripped up by other idols that we put in place of God as well, which can also happen in marriage. And it can happen out of love. It can happen out of serving a way that you think you should be serving. I think that's why that notion of how to be a Christian wife
Mm.
really hit me, because, there's all these ways that you think you should be ticking these boxes or what you should be doing, or, and,
Yeah.
and I think as Christians, we should also just be working to encourage each other to grow in Christ first and to put that love first. And
Absolutely.
it might look different for every marriage or whatnot, but to give people that kind of permission, because I was thinking, you know, um, when you get people saying to you, well, it must be so perfect. And again, as I said, you're not out to go, well, really, but you
Right.
are,
Yes, exactly.
but you are thinking, you know what, like this is real. And there are beautiful things in
Mhm.
marriage that bring you close together. And there are
Yeah,
also struggles. Those vows are real.
right.
And what are you going to do when you're actually trying to live those things out? What are the lessons that you do want your children to know, and that you can still come through, not actually because of our acts, but because of grace?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it has to be enacted between you, and in your own heart too. Sometimes, it's about resolving things that almost always just between you and God.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know.
So when you start to write, or let me ask you, because I am very curious, are you thinking another memoir? Like, I don't think you set out to be a memoirist, but
No,
you are a
I.
memoirist.
Well, so are you now.
Yeah, but you're
It's
two
all about
ahead.
us, Karen. Get our covers on the next one together. Karen and Carolyn with Brent and Kent.
Oh, gosh, you're killing me. So
It's
are
so true,
you gonna,
because if you,
yeah.
it is, you do seem, it feels like a cheesy memoir sometimes, like, right, I've got all these things to say about me, like that, you don't.
Right, right.
But it's yeah, I don't, like, I never would have anticipated it, and yet um I really enjoy looking at God's work in my life.
Hmm. Yeah,
um
that's good.
I've always been a journaler, always extending those kind of thoughts in other ways, and thinking about, again, not necessarily just helping others, but creating a conversational space, right? That conversion and conversation, like we meet, at together, and creating that kind of space, because I know that that's what brought me to the table of Christ, was the invitation,
That's good.
the questioning, the invitation, the being the realness of Christians I met.
Yeah.
The realness about their joy and their realness about their brokenness. And I think I get the greatest hope myself, Karen, from not that it's done perfectly or fakely, but that you are really doing it in Christ. You're really trying,
Yeah.
and with each other. And I find that I don't know how people live without faith.
Yeah,
I
I
really
know.
don't.
I feel that way
You
too.
know, like I can honestly say that. I mean, I can certainly see the bumps and arrows and everything
Mhm.
that come against it for sure. But when the chips are down,
Yeah.
what else is there?
Yeah.
And so I really, I benefit. I remember reading Madeleine L'Engle. I didn't know Madeleine L'Engle had written several spiritual autobiographies in her Crosswicks journals. I had always
Okay.
known her as a, children's writer and that. And a
Yeah.
few years ago, a friend of mine introduced me to them, and I just gorged on them. I always
Mm.
do that. I get onto an author and then I have like a full author buffet for that.
Yeah.
And I loved her Crosswicks journals. Like they were so, and they are memoir, but
Mm.
like, and even she said, I'm just a little old lady who writes in a chicken coop out in my farm.
Yeah.
Like, in a way, part of me says I have nothing to say,
Right.
but I found them beautiful and profound and very, very real. Everything from like small town gossip and how, how that affects you as a Christian to, writing and
Hmm.
thoughts on art and thoughts of what does it mean to be a Christian artist. And she's really able to mingle the profound and the everyday and the
Yeah.
provincial and the profound. And I love that. That's where we're at
Yeah,
for
that's
all of
so
us.
powerful. And again, just, our true stories, inviting other people in. And I think the boundaries blur too. Like I can read a work that's more even, like say popular theology or something, and all of a sudden there's a chunk of memoir in there. And I think,
Yes. Yeah.
that's really effective and fair and good. I remember
Yeah.
early on, I was having lunch with these two other writers who are more like journalistic writers, and they started to kind of like make fun of memoir, I guess. And so I was like, finally, I thought, I need you to know that I'm actually writing a memoir.
Awkward.
It's so awkward. Oh my goodness. But I understood what they were getting at. Like, and I think they didn't maybe quite understand spiritual memoir, but they, it's that it's about me thing. And it's like, no, good memoir isn't really. Good memoir is about
Mhm.
us, and good spiritual memoir is
That's
about,
really true.
us and God, and
Yeah. Yeah.
living this together. And I think too of the role reading plays in my life, and that also gives me confidence to write. Actually, when I know I've been so
Mhm.
impacted by, spiritual reading.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a powerful way of writing and reading.
Well, and reading is such a compassionate experience. I love
Mhm.
that idea of us being in this and the
Yeah.
reader being in it with you too. And it isn't a compassionate experience. I mean, I remember doing when I was doing psychological research at one point too. Like we're more compassionate even after we just read a list of metaphors.
Hmm.
We test more compassionate than we do beforehand. All that. It's very interesting how we respond to reading and entering into someone else's story. And that's so important in fiction. But what I find really interesting reading, especially spiritual memoirs, I know I'm going in thinking this person is actually really trying to look at this through the lens of God in their lives. And it has more resonance for me. So in some ways, I feel like it does bear more responsibility. But then it also, you know, bears more truth, I think, as well. I remember a scene in your book that stuck with me too, when you were talking about uh, your Sunday morning in the cafe being like a
Yes.
normal human being. It's like the rest of the
Yeah.
race.
What? You people are having
The rest
fun.
of the race. Sitting there with your coffee and you're like not in church. And that struck me as not just about being a pastor's wife and not even just about being a woman, but back to what you've been saying about your, being among colleagues or journalists who are like, oh, memoirists, oh my goodness, eye roll. I work in secular academia often too, and I get the eye roll about Christians. And part
Yes,
of you
I
wants to be
bet.
like, yoo-hoo. I believe that. Um,
Yes.
I was actually told by a group of academic colleagues at one point that I couldn't teach the Bible because I believed in it.
Wow, that is so
So
crazy.
you get the stuff, right? And I thought it was so eye-opening to realize that you were also talking about just the Christian experience, just being
Mm,
even in our world and not of it.
yeah.
But it's not necessarily just a women's book either. And I think that's where spiritual autobiography is so profound. It's not really driven by gender. It's not driven by politics. Like there's something so much bigger. Because when I read that, I, I felt this immense connection with that.
Mm,
That kind of sometimes the loneliness that's created in us being believers in our culture. And also this like, wow, what am I missing? You know,
yes, yes.
all those mornings in church and wow, I'm missing the latte in the cafe with the people walking their dogs. I've had that
Mm,
experience. And it just really triggered deeply for me of how different we are as Christians
yeah,
and we should be, but that doesn't always that's joyous, but that also hurts sometimes,
yeah,
you
absolutely.
know, and Jesus would be the first one to say, of course it does, right? So like but you know, the peace I give to you is not the world's peace. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that spiritual memoir opens up lots of things to all of our walks as Christians.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would be your top advice? And then we should probably wind down, even though I could literally do this all day with you.
I know
But
that's why we're going to have our cottage and
yes.
all of our wine cellar and our stack of books together. And
Top advice for a writer who maybe hasn't written like this before, or just encouragement for a writer who wants to do spiritual memoir.
mm, I think my hands down number one thing would be to say what Frederick Buechner said, uh, which is just to pay attention.
Yes, yeah.
Just pay attention. And concrete ways to do that are things like journaling
Hmm.
and journaling without worrying. Just journal, journal, journal. I've always been a journaler, and I sometimes get in these fits where I actually organize the journals according to topics. That's when I'm feeling hyper controlling. But then I've also learned to just have journals where I just dump
Okay.
stuff.
Yeah.
And journaling is so freeing, and I recommend cursive, like recommend hand to page. There's
Yeah.
actually research that also shows that kind of contact actually can really help you um, therapeutically as opposed to typing. Sometimes a screen is actually very jarring or there's not as much connection. But any way that it works for you, just just paying attention.
Yeah.
Um, and really thinking again, this isn't meant to be a cheesy optimistic statement, you know, from a swirls rise kind of Christian stereotype, but
Go ahead.
because you know, often Karen, like I get to the end of my day, I think, oh, this happened and this happened and this happened, and you know, gratitude journaling really is amazing.
Hmm.
It really does unlock your heart and open it to things, but also just looking at the incredible way that everything tips towards grace,
Yeah. Yeah.
even in immense sorrow or grief or loss or whatever. Like I'm just amazed at all the spiritual warfare that's done on our behalf that we probably don't even know about.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I would think just paying attention
I love that
and finding a
advice.
way that helps you cultivate that.
Yeah, that's really good, and record that. And I think,
Record
for
it.
a writer, those books, and so I'm not nearly as organized as you to have thematic journals, but I have a number of, writing journals floating around.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I write ideas or just things that happened. Like in the book near the end, I have a scene where I'm being blessed by 100-year-old minister's widow named Millicent. And when that happened, I was actually sort of in the process of writing this book. And I literally
Mm,
ran home, from this amazing
wow.
moment with her to capture it because I knew, well, first of all, it was just beautiful and meaningful and a gift to me. But
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
writer mind was like, "Anne, this is amazing and probably belongs in
Mm,
my book, and I need to capture this, as
hmm.
quickly and fully as I could." So, there's
Hmm.
it helps us with our thinking, but it also helps us with our craft, and so
It
that's
really does. I have a friend who keeps a really tiny notebook. He's a
okay.
wonderful poet. He actually keeps a notebook on him all the time. One of
Mhm.
those little dollar store because
Yeah.
he does because I think sometimes if we can forget, right? Like you just
Yes.
get home, you get busy with something else, just jot it down or even jot like a couple of prompts and go back to it later because otherwise it's like a
Absolutely.
dream. You can lose sense of it.
Yeah.
And if you go back and look, it's also really amazing
Yeah.
to see.
Let me tell you, one night I woke up in the middle of the night with such clarity about what my book was about that I was like,
Wow.
oh, finally, yes. And then in the morning, I literally could not remember it.
Oh, no.
And it's never come back to me. It's never come back to me. So,
Isn't that
yes, I
bizarre?
know.
Although
So,
maybe
yes,
you lived
write
into it
things
without
down.
knowing. Yeah, you might have
I
lived into
hope
it.
so.
Yeah, yeah. Was it, because I was going to ask you just really quickly too, like
Yeah.
was it a certain event that prompted your book, or was it long simmering,
Okay.
in that way?
No, it was both. I went back to
It was both.
school to do a Master of
Okay.
Fine Art and Creative Nonfiction, and I had to do a book length manuscript. And because
Oh,
I've been like a journalistic type writer, I thought, no, now's the time to do something, you know, new and different and really difficult and challenging as
wow.
a writer. And so I dove into spiritual memoir. Yeah,
Wow, that's very different. Yeah.
yeah.
That's
So
neat.
yeah,
Good for
yeah.
you.
So Carolyn, how can people find your book and where can they find you online?
Um, the best place online is just my website, carolynweber.com. I try to answer every email personally. So if you have patience, you can click through there. And there's my email address is probably the most. I do have a Facebook as well. I do tweet here and there, but social media wise, I'm probably still personal email is the best through my website. And the book, you can read more about it there and click through as well. And it's also available on Amazon too.
Excellent. Very good. And
Thank you.
I'm on at karenstiller.com and also, trying my best on social media, but there's nothing I love more than to get an email from my website, from, a reader or a fellow writer or these days.
It's really nice because you
So
can have more detail. Yes, you can
yeah,
hear more
it's
detail
fun.
and have a little relationship. Yeah.
Carolyn, I have had a great time.
Oh, me too. I always do with you.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me and getting together. And I think that this is a great topic that I hope more people will be interested in pursuing for themselves too.
Yeah.